I would like to welcome you to the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership's Second International Symposium, Project Leadership in a Changing World. I'm Margaret Gardol, I'm the Institute Manager, and as we start this event, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional owners of the land that our team are on, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you are on around Australia, and also to any other nations internationally. So I would now like to introduce Professor Jennifer Whyte, who leads both the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership and the School of Project Management, to open our Second International Symposium.
Thank you, Margaret. As Director of the Institute, I would like to welcome you all to this International Symposium. We set this up to bring the international community of scholars with leading industry together to explore how project leaders and project managers can respond to a world that's in flux, changing technologies, changing organisations and societies, and a changing environment. This morning, we have speakers and participants from across the globe. I welcome those of you joining us in your morning across Australia and in New Zealand, or in your afternoon and evening from the Americas. Wherever you are, we're excited to have you with us. Before I introduce John Grill, let me say a few words about the agenda. We hope to explore these issues about project leadership in a changing world with you as we move through this agenda today. First of all, we've got a panel of experts talking on project leadership and project teams, exploring our expectations of project leaders as they have to shift to address this changing world. I'm delighted this will be chaired by Associate Professor Julian Pollock, who has written extensively on the changing paradigms of project management, on complex projects and on project teams. And he will introduce our distinguished panel of speakers for that session. Second, we have a panel of experts on collaborative contracts, project governance and project setup. And I'm delighted that this will be chaired by our visiting professor, Professor Nuno Gill, who's here in Sydney on sabbatical from the University of Manchester, UK. His work is on infrastructure megaprojects, and it's really transforming our understanding of projects and of project value. And he will again introduce our distinguished set of speakers for this panel. We then have a series of keynote presentations from distinguished professors across the globe. The titles of these are Alliancing and Collaboration on Projects. It's Professor Derek Walker from RMIT talking on that. Organising Responses to Climate Change, Mitigation, Adaptation and Suffering as Political Projects. We have Chris Wright from Sydney talking about that. Capital Project Dilemmas, Professor Nuno Gill will talk about. How Datafication is reshaping the project management sandbox. And Professor Alejandro Romero Torres from the University of Quebec will talk to us about that. Innovation and impact of emerging technologies in project management. We've got Dr. Mohammed O'Day from Penn State University. And then I will round off that session talking about my own research on megaprojects, future making and projects as interventions. So we have quite a packed morning. I believe that the link to the agenda, the full agenda is in chat. Margaret will keep us in time through the research keynotes in brief, and then I will formally close the webinar part of this and invite you to join one of our interactive breakout groups to continue the conversation on project analytics, on collaborative contracts, on project leadership. So I'm going to hand you over to John Grill, whose vision for improving project leadership founded our institute. He's kindly recorded a couple of minutes of introduction for us.
I am delighted to see this year's symposium come together with such experienced thought leaders in projects both in Australia and internationally. The themes presented today are significant issues that require deeper understanding and debate in an ever-increasingly changing world. The Institute continues to move in a direction to achieve my vision on changing the dial on how projects are conceived, delivered and achieve their outcomes in the communities and systems they are part of. We have the best and brightest at the university dedicated to this vision. Having the opportunity to hear novel approaches, discuss new ideas amongst a diverse range of experts will be valuable time spent, whether you are in government, industry or academia, and the Institute is ideally placed to convene and curate this event. I want to thank Mark Scott and the Dean for their leadership and support of the Institute and commend the work of Professor Jennifer Whyte and her team of academics and professional staff. They have drawn on their international network to offer this important opportunity. Thank you for attending, and we will continue to keep you engaged and abreast of any new thinking and analysis in projects that intervene in our changing world. I will leave this now to the Institute Director, Jennifer, to introduce the Institute and get the sessions underway.
So over the last 10 years, John's investment at the University of Sydney has inspired and educated project managers in senior leadership positions. The symposium today is hosted by the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership. We have the ambition to be the go-to place for advice on how to conceive, set up and execute projects. More information on the Institute is on the slide, and I think there's a link in chat. I'd like to start this morning with two observations. First, that all projects are future-oriented. In our changing world, they're used to achieve desired ends. For example, to manage response and recovery in the face of disasters, to design and deliver vaccines, to deliver future forms of energy, as well as adapting transport and delivering new infrastructure. Projects and portfolios and programs of projects are widespread. Some scholars go as far as to describe the projectification of society. Second, that futures are uncertain. Projects require us to engage with multiple stakeholders, with diverse values and evaluations of projects and what they deliver. In the face of an uncertain world, achieving desired and desirable outcomes through projects does not only require technical decisions, it also requires ethical choices. This requires engineers, project managers, and leaders to consider and make social and technological decisions, keeping in mind future generations and the relationship with the planet. It requires them to look at the problem holistically, or we might say to take a systems approach. And so we're really keen to activate areas of research in the international project scholarship community through this symposium. There are big questions for project management, education and research about how we as a global society deliver what future generations need. I see this not only as a challenge for practitioners, although of course it's a challenge for practitioners as well. I think it's a challenge for us in the research community to understand how we can understand this and provide insight. So as a research community, we need to connect across the globe to share best practice on projects, whether that's through megaprojects or through programs of smaller interventions. We see this symposium as a flagship activity in the Institute, and this year and next year it's associated with a call for papers in project leadership and society. We hope to foster research on project leadership in a changing world. We actively support the major conferences, and together with Professor Nuno Gil, I'm hosting the next Megaproject workshop at the University of Sydney, and a paper development workshop for the Californian Management Review special issue that's associated with that. We're also engaged in many of the major conferences globally. So let us start the first session. I'm going to hand over to Julian, who will chair this important discussion on project leadership.
Thank you, Jennifer. So in our first session, we're focusing on project teams and questions central to project leadership. My name's Julian Pollack, and we're looking at the question of project leadership, which increasingly incurs in the context of increasing risks, requiring adaptability to change, especially as projects grow in duration and complexity. With a focus on the emerging demands that are placed on project leaders and teams, we explore the ways that our existing narrative of project leadership and cultures of team management need to grow to meet capability and life cycle constraints. Now, I'm very fortunate to be joined by three great speakers to discuss these issues. I'd like to start by introducing Sonia Campbell, who is Deputy Director Commercial for New South Wales Treasury, previously Director of Capital Projects at PwC. I'm also joined by Professor Stuart Clegg, who is with us at the University of Sydney, who has made a major contribution to power and paradox in the context of organisational theorising and project management research. And I think we should also have Professor Jeff Pinto from Penn State with us. But it looks like Jeff is having some connection difficulties, which hopefully we can get past in the near future. When Jeff does join us, he's Program Chair of the MPM program at Penn State and holds the Andrew Morris and Elizabeth Lee Black Chair in Management Technology. So I'd like to start the conversation by asking a question to you, Sonia. What are some of the major leadership challenges that you're seeing in your work at the moment?
Good morning, Julian, and thank you for the very kind introduction and the invitation to participate in the discussion this morning. I guess my first observation from where I sit in Treasury with a very large portfolio of projects is that there's just been increasing complexity and scale of the projects that we're seeking to deliver, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. And there hasn't necessarily been the same investment in the capacity and capability of the leaders who have both those project management and people management skills to be able to deliver those projects. And it's in that context that there is really that increasing need to acknowledge that different leadership styles are needed at different phases of projects. If you think about the project life cycle, they often have very long durations. And in the world of government, there's a strong need at the very beginning to demonstrate that there is a need and the benefits and the outcomes from that investment, and making the business case all the way through then to engaging with the market, shaping those projects, and then being able to deliver on those outcomes and benefits in a way that is accountable and responsible. And I think the biggest challenge for leaders at the moment is how do we establish those project teams and the necessary leadership skills required to balance all of the competing interests that will change over time in an increasingly dynamic and complex environment, knowing that we will never know all of the project risks at the time that we, embark on defining the project and establishing those relationships, with the necessary, partners to be able to deliver those benefits. And one of the things I've observed over my time, I've worked for very large contractors, I've worked on the client side, I've worked on the consulting side, is that there is a need for that different leadership and not necessarily a focus on project continuity and communication of, those outcomes that we set out to achieve at the beginning. And often that is lost through scope creep, etc. But how do we properly transition from that project development phase through to the project delivery phase? And what are the skills of our people that we need? And so I think there needs to be a real focus on that. It's a dynamic and complex world in delivering major projects. And in my portfolio, that spans everything from infrastructure to whole of government procurement to banking reforms, major asset sales. So that there is a big people ask, and I think that we need to continue to focus on how we create that culture and understanding and communication that's needed to successfully deliver these projects.
Sonia, you mentioned that there's different skills and capabilities required in not just team formation, but also leadership as we move across different project phases. Could you expand on that a little?
Yeah, I think, I'm often saying that you've got a lot of people who like to come in and do the deals, and it creates a lot of complexity. And then you bring in a new team to actually deliver on, the deal that was done, so to speak, without the necessary transition. And as our contractual requirements get very complex, it's incredibly difficult to actually understand what your rights and obligations are as you navigate through that project delivery phase. And so I've always been very focused in my different roles in making sure that there is that communication and being able to translate that complexity to people to understand what their role is. And then that's, the need for the project leader to create that culture. Think about the project as an enterprise or an organization, that has, outcomes that need to be delivered. How do you define that for people all across the projects? And when you're talking about projects, some of these mega infrastructure projects that are worth billions of dollars, we see payment claims coming through that are like $100 million a month. So how do you actually assess that scope and ensure the quality of the work? It's an incredibly complex and demanding role that we're expecting of our leaders. And I'm often saying as a leader, I don't have all the answers and I can't do it myself. So it's about having and building a team around me and empowering them, to be able to go and deliver, on a very clear set of objectives that have been established from the duration of the project. And there's the complexity of the stakeholder environment as well, Julian. In the world of government, we're increasingly doing, precinct style work where you've got, community and a lot of competing and different interests. It's a really big job in itself to manage that type of stakeholder engagement. And the real challenge at the moment is we've got a very hot labour market here. I think, as everybody knows, a lot of competition for the best resources, with a lot of investment that's happened, particularly additional stimulus that went into the economy through COVID. How do we make sure we're doing the right projects for the right reasons, and that we've got the people and the support that they need? And that goes to systems as well, and technology, which is something that I think in the Australian market, we've still got a lot of room to improve in terms of how we harness, the capability that's there to improve project outcomes.
So this idea of deliberately using different people to lead and manage different project phases is a very interesting one, and potentially something which I imagine could help address some of the resource constraints that we might sometimes be facing. But Stuart, if I could ask you to extend on this, the opportunity to deliberately hire people for different project phases may address some individual capability issues, but what else does it imply in terms of handover?
Sure. I mean, this is an approach that's often used with lots of complex projects. It doesn't always work as well as it should, because every time you have a change of project leader, you have a handover problem, and handoffs can be very, very problematic. Carl Whyte, who has done a lot of research in this area, looked at disasters at airports, looked at hospitals and clinical errors that have occurred in hospitals. These often occur as a result of handoffs, handovers, as we would say in Australia. So I think you might be solving some problems with that solution, but I think you could be creating new ones. Now, the alternative is that you have to have some kind of polymath who is a project leader who can lead through everything with skills and capabilities capable of the full range, from sort of digital through to construction, through to the politics with government and community relations. Well, we're not going to find those polymaths very easily. So we will have the handover issues, the handover problems. So that probably means a lot of scoping and a lot of collaboration through the process. So that rather than seeing these as discrete phases and discrete chunks, they need to be overlapped, there needs to be collaboration, and there needs to be coactive relations, collaborative power relations between the different parties as they forward the project, as they progress the project.
That's really interesting, this idea of overlapping different phases and making a smoother handover between different groups. Yeah. Jeff, it's great to see that you've managed to join us and overcome technical difficulties in a virtual environment. It has happened to all of us at one stage or another, but I'm glad you got here in time. I understand you've also done some research into the need to replace project managers during delivery.
That's correct, Julian. I was intrigued to hear what Stuart had to say precisely on this account, because it does mirror pretty closely our findings. I agree with him. I believe he's completely correct that the process of handoffs or handovers can be fraught with a whole lot of difficulties. When we did our study, when I say we, I'm referring to Francesco Di Magaloni and Kate Davis in the UK and myself. We were looking at instances where it was determined that it was necessary to replace a project manager mid-project while it was ongoing, and what were oftentimes the reasons why that might occur. Among the reasons we found were, first of all, the obvious ones, sort of an abject failure. If the person was attempting to run the project and was not meeting their gates, so they were using some sort of stage gate process and they simply were not keeping up with it. So the project was showing a steady series of underperformances in schedule and time. Alternatively, what we found was that in many cases, these handovers are planned. They're done on purpose. I completely agree with Stuart's point. The polymath, the Sir John Arnott, for example, in the UK, who's done such marvelous work with the London Olympics and then was working on rail and on some of their energy projects. Yes, those folks are specifically people that come to mind precisely because they are so rare. And so rather than staking our hopes on the unicorn that can take us from the beginning of the process to the end, what we found in our study was that many times project replacement is not a black mark against the project manager. In fact, it is done purposefully because they recognize that the skill set necessary to run the front end, perhaps to get all the ducks in a row, is not the one that will allow them to deal with the technical challenges downstream. And so, or again, to Stuart's point, that the problem may be one of integration, that you may have a project manager, Simon Wright for London Crossrail, who did a great job with getting all the pieces done, but failed with the integration aspect of it. And because of that, they had to replace him at a point in 2018 because the project was lagging as a result. So absolutely, I think there are times when it's necessary to make that change. Sometimes it's forced upon an organization. Surprisingly, many times it's planned, it's built in. But again, Stuart is correct also that the nature of the stages are much more dynamic and they're much more fluid. They don't have sharp points of saying, okay, here's when it has to be done. These things are oftentimes emergent.
Now, Jeff, I imagine that as we culturally move from a position of expecting someone to be the unicorn polymath, heroic project manager who carries something throughout all phases, we might encounter some cultural issues. We might find some resistance to this idea. Would that be correct?
I think it is correct, but it's correct to the degree that we prepare the soil in advance. I think the happenstance of replacing a project manager can be, I hate to use the word cataclysmic because I don't mean to be to over egg it, but there are times when we have to replace, and at that point, many times the project is in such a deep hole that the culture, if you will, of the project as it has been moving along is so poor that the first thing that we found in our research that a new project manager has to come in and do is affirm the basic commitments, affirm the basic goals and the plans of what the project is about. But within the context of making those basic affirmations, also taking a sickle to some of the other behaviors that are taking place, not simply the project activities, but even the underlying cultural issues that are starting to emerge there as well. And so that makes it doubly difficult for these emergent project managers or these replacement project managers to make their mark, because they have to do it moving against the flow of cultural mores at that point in time, which many times have become very damaging. And I know I've done work again with Kate Davis looking at normalization of deviance, and the whole idea of, if you will, a sick organizational culture many times is manifested by the fact that they've allowed deviant behaviors to continue on unchecked. And that many times is a symptom of a much deeper cultural project problem that's existing.
Okay, that's really interesting. Sonia, if I could ask you to potentially extend on this. In your experience, how are our behavioural expectations for project leaders and the teams they work with changing?
Yeah, I think, we've had a project culture, at least here in Australia, for some time that has been widely regarded as, quite antagonistic. And I think that has come from behaviours that, both on the client and the contractor side are there to sort of, protect budgets and, have to finish the project on time, and have become quite contractual. And I think the shift now is an expectation in the behaviour of those leaders to be collaborative. And what does that mean? How do we define what collaboration is? And it's not something that you can necessarily put into words or put into a contract, or easily be able to measure. And what it requires of leaders is a big time commitment. It's about consultation. It's about picking up the phone and building relationships and building trust so that you can come together to resolve problems without necessarily, resorting to the contract or, protecting your position. And so how do we set up projects now to actually align behaviours and, create that best for project mindset, in the leaders on both sides or on all sides of the project, because it applies down the supply chain as well. I think that takes a particular skill set to be able to do that. And that's not necessarily something that, is in the textbook project management, when you're looking at how you manage, schedule and cost and resources, etc. It's a combination of those skills. And I often, reflect on comments made by some of the very large contractors that, for these big projects, they're actually looking for like a CEO type skill set to be able to lead them, which is a very different approach to what we have seen in the past when projects were potentially, better defined and in a less complex environment. So I think that's the behavioural shift is understanding, what collaboration looks like and building trust, which is a necessary element to how you can manage risk, which is always going to arise on any project.
That's really interesting. I think that you're really identifying something crucial here. And Stuart, can I ask you to extend on this? You used the word coactive when talking about a collaborative relationship that project leaders and teams might have in developing the project context. Could you expand on that, please? You're on mute, Stuart.
Thanks for telling me. Yeah, the concept of coactive relations goes way back to a founding mother of management thinking, and I like the idea. I've seen it in practice. I've seen it in practice in project leadership, where various disciplines in the project team become champions for objectives which are outside of their normal disciplinary sphere of competence. So they learn to stand in the shoes of the others. They learn to stand in the role, and through being in the role, they begin to gain more sympathy and synergy with some of the problems and issues that the team experiences. So instead of the team seeing, oh, this person's just going on about their thing, everybody gets a chance, or the leadership team get a chance to change roles, to exchange roles, and to begin to see the project in a more holistic way. And I think this worked remarkably effectively in the instances in which I've seen it. Coactive relations need to be not only team-based within the leadership team, we also need to think on a broader palette. The kind of major infrastructure projects which are occurring right now in this city, Sydney, and I'm sure in other cities around the world, often are very, very intrusive and threatening. Their meaning is scary for the people who live in or proximate to the communities in which these things are occurring. We need to be able to see the whole job of project leadership as being able to communicate meaningfully, socially, to those people. And the role of social media is particularly important in this area. I've done some work with my colleague Johan Neenan on metro developments in Chennai in India. And we've looked at the role of social media there to try and media manage some of the resistance and dissensus that can occur in communities. It will happen anyway, even if you try to manage it. But we have to get away from the idea of a kind of crash through or crash mentality. We have to try and be more positive in listening to the objections that might occur from a community, simply because they're not technically based, they're not engineers, they're not project managers, but sometimes they might have some good ideas and we need to take them on board. And we should have some forms of structural relations within projects which can listen to what gets to be said from the community, rather than having an adversarial relationship. As Sonia said, the relationships can get very adversarial on this front, both within the team, between different skills, different disciplines within the team, but also between the team and the communities within which the infrastructure is being built.
So, Stuart, what does that mean for people in a project context needing to attend to meaning? Are we needing to become more effective in controlling the meaning which is put out, or is it more of a case of co-creating local meaning with our project stakeholders, or a mix of both?
Well, I think the first thing is realizing that meaning is important. It's not something that you impose on a situation, and it isn't simply given by the dictates of project management, the dictates of engineering, the dictates of law, or the dictates of the contract. I mean, contracts are complex opportunities to try to minimize risk, which, when risk occurs, because events happen, they always will happen, then you have lawyers at 10 paces. And yeah, it's great for barristers, it keeps them in Mercedes, but it's not necessarily great for projects. So if we can actually build more understanding and meaningfulness into the ways in which project leadership teams manage, we might just, a few barristers may have a few less Mercedes, and that's a pity for them, but it might be better for the projects. Now, what that entails, I think, is the realization that project management isn't just a technical discipline. It's not just a question of technique. Really, I would say this, I'm a sociologist, a social scientist. It demands some people skills. and some acquaintance with some of the core disciplines of social science is the way to at least get that across to future generations. So we need to have broad-based curricula in education.
I think there are also interesting implications here for the need to be open to meaning generation rather than just trying to defend an established position. Jeff, I know you've done some research on authenticity. Does this change in our expectations for project leaders imply a different level of authenticity that's required?
It's an interesting question, Julian. The problem, I guess, and let me just shape this a bit. The problem, the focus that we deal with is when you have embedded systems in place, cultural systems, expectations for cybernetic control for the way we manage the projects themselves. The problem is that when we're coming into a situation that is underperforming, so whether it's a project team, whether it's a project organization, whether we're talking at a micro level, at a much larger level, the problem becomes one of how do we manifest legitimate change here? Now, that's almost a naive question to ask, and I recognize that, and therefore I think part of the response here can also strike people initially as naive, and yet part of the problem is that we, particularly as scholars, we tend to look at these things many times from a much more complex perspective, and that's not to say that we don't have some logic behind why we do that. But yet, those of us who also work with projects, with project teams, and with project managers, we can harken back to some of the work that was done back in the 90s, for example, when Eli Goldratt first came out with Critical Chain. For some of us, we looked at Critical Chain, and I know people like Bill Duncan and some other folks from PMI, they sort of said it's much ado about nothing. It doesn't really, or it's all he's doing is wrapping up old wine in new bottles, but it's the same thing we know. I tend to disagree. I think that what he was getting at there, and at least for me, it was really phenomenally important, was recognizing that if we want to continue to fail the same old way we've been failing with projects, we should manage them the same old way we've been managing them. And so he started saying things that were at the time really rather fascinating. So he started looking behaviorally at why projects run late. And I just finished a paper that was published on this particular topic. And one of the things that he argued, and I echo this from my own experience, so this isn't just sort of scanning the journals, this is working with project managers, is that there is an embedded need for self-preservation out there. And that is all the way up and down the project ladder. So everybody working on a project, project managers themselves, managers of project managers, program level and even higher, we all have an embedded self-preservation motivation. And so what he was getting at was what we have to do here is we have to agree to mutually disarm, if I can put it that way. And that is, so here's one example, and I won't belabor all of his points, but his one example was every one of us has a vested interest in maintaining as much personal slack as we possibly can maintain. So we do this by padding our estimates. How long will this take you to do, Jeff? 10 days. Well, it really only takes me 5 days, but I need that extra 5 days because that gives me some personal safety. Now, when you work that logic, that thought process up and down the corporate ladder, you can see that we create these projects with these grotesque timelines because everybody's factoring this in and everybody knows everybody else is doing it. And so they're working like crazy to find ways to pry some of this safety out of the system. The irony, the underlying irony is that none of this, whether it's factoring in safety or trying to get rid of safety, none of this is based on honest communication and honest dialogue. And that's what was Goldratt's point. We need to disarm. Now, one of the ways we disarm as a project manager, for example, whether you're talking about a mega project or you're talking about a much more finite project, but the first thing we have to do is recognize that we have these motivations. And so I, as the project manager, have to signal, and this is where the authenticity term comes in. I have to signal that I am going to accept a 50-50 likelihood of your estimate for how long it'll take. 50-50 means exactly that. You may hit it, you may miss it, but at least you're giving me an honest assessment. Bob Graham, who I used to do some work with in consulting, he had a great expression about this. He said, if you don't take my time estimate seriously, I'm not going to give you serious time estimates. So what we have to do is start, and this is where authenticity applies, is we have to mutually disarm. We have, as project managers and as people working at that level, we have to start signaling to our folks that I'm going to back you. We're going to work on this process together, and we're going to jointly make this succeed. But you see, this becomes this we're fighting against an embedded culture. And so the first thing we have to do is recognize that all the pressures in the organization are working against this happening, because I want to protect myself and you want to protect yourself, et cetera. And so we have to stop doing that, and we have to start working jointly. Now, I realize I'm giving a very brief peroration on a much, much more complex idea, and I recognize that in this time we have. But that's what it's coming down to, is recognizing the point that project managers and project team members have to start working jointly rather than at cross currents.
That's really interesting. It seems like we're coming increasingly to questions of empowerment, providing a culture where teams can work effectively. Sonia, if I can pass to you at this point, how do we actually create an environment where we can empower teams over time, whether that is creating a culture in an organization or one that persists through a long duration project as it moves through phases?
That's a very difficult question, Julian, and I'm not sure I have a simple answer for it. I think it's it's more conversations like this, and it's definitely a recognition from the top down. When I connect in with some of the Project 13, thought leadership, it's all about, that commitment from the very top of the board all the way through the senior leadership around how you're going to establish that culture and those relationships and take forward your projects. And I think without that commitment from the very top, it presents a lot of challenges, to Jeff's point that, people will be self-interested. And so how you overcome that, I think, is certainly the biggest challenge we have for project leadership at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. We are almost to the end of this session, but I'd like to, we've had some excellent questions come up in the chat, and I'd like to look at one from Ian Heppenstall. If polymaths are so rare, might this be linked to the over-specialization of project skills? And if so, what can academia and business do to develop breadth of experience rather than depth? Stuart, I was wondering if you had a comment in response to this. And you're on mute.
Thanks again for reminding me. Yes, the curriculum's mighty crowded. There are many, many things that we need to teach. We need to teach students. I think hands-on experience is really important. The sooner we can have prospective project managers thinking about projects, designing ways in which they would accomplish projects, doing little mini projects, this gives them some grasp of reality. Otherwise, it's all textbook and article based. So we have to try to give them concrete experience. I think this is an extremely important thing to do. as I said previously, I also think that it's important that we don't over-technicize the curriculum. We must draw on the insights of the social sciences and try to feed them into the curriculum process, because projects are not just a technical accomplishment; they're a social accomplishment. And as a social accomplishment, it helps enormously if people have some understanding of how social realities get to be constructed, what the importance of meaning is, and how relations between people typically unfold.
This has been a really interesting conversation. So I'd like to thank Sonia Campbell, Stuart Clegg, Jeff Pinto for joining us. We've really come across questions of the need to develop a culture of trust. That one of the ways of developing this might be to not only starting small in some areas where we can test things in a safe environment, but also to lead with the behaviours that we need to see. We've covered questions around the shifting dialogue from an egocentric heroic leader to questions of shared leadership, co-creation, and multiple parties involved in the leadership process, both in terms of co-creation with stakeholders, but as we move from inception through delivery and into handover. I'd now like to pass over to Professor Nuno Gil from Manchester University. Sonia, thank you for mentioning Project 13. This is probably something which might be referenced in the next section, which is looking at questions of collaborative contracts, project governance, and setup. So thank you once again. And Nuno, the chair is yours.
So thanks very much for the fantastic session before ours. And now we are moving to a second session, session 2, on collaborative contracts, project governance, and setup. And it's really my privilege to have with us a fantastic group of panelists. So as you will see from the slide, so we have Gemma Wittig from Bechtel Civil Infrastructure, who is involved in Sydney Metro here. Then we have Kate, and I'm not going to dare to pronounce your surname, Kate, because I don't want to become embarrassed, from the University of Toronto. And Kate has been doing extremely insightful research on the relationship between capital-intensive organizations and non-market stakeholders, and I will let Kate tell us a bit more about that. And Peter Colascino, that I have not met personally yet here in Australia, but I understand that he had a major role with Infrastructure Australia, and just recently you have set up consultancy Vista Strategy. So I'm really excited with the structure of this panel. This is about collaborative contracts, project governance, and setup, but the emphasis here is not going to be on collaborative contracts to govern the project supply chain. Rather, the emphasis here on the contracts to govern what sometimes we call these non-market stakeholders. So like the local communities, local authorities, activists, interest groups, which are becoming increasingly important for project leaders, especially as society expects more and more from capital-intensive projects. Now, the kind of expects that the purpose of these projects be defined by grand challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality. But at the same time, despite all these challenges in addressing these wicked problems, the managers of these big projects are also quite constrained by a legacy of project management norms that say, well, guys, you have to deliver the project on time and within budget. So how can you reconcile that legacy of on time, on budget, the golden triangle, with this increasing pressure to widen the purpose of projects? And and of course, this is going to have direct impact on the management of the relationships with the supply chain, which is so we have these two orthogonal relationships here going on. So to kick off this discussion, I've asked Kate first to go first and share some insights from her own research. Then Peter will share the view of the policymaker, and then Gemma, who is really as skin in the game as being as acting director of Sydney Metro, and I'm sure she has she's right now thinking about how to tackle some of these challenges. And after a first set of introductions, we will we'll continue the conversation in the panel. Kate, so would you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Nuno, and thank you for the University of Sydney for hosting us. So just so I don't bury the headline, my research, and I think part of the answer to Nuno's question, is collaborate with your critics. So let me elaborate what I mean by that. So because we're talking about capital-intensive projects, today I'm going to focus on the rise of formal contracting between project proponents and local communities. Some of you may know there's been a real increase in the use of formal contracts. They're sometimes called community benefits agreements, impact benefits agreements, and they're meant to manage relationships with communities that are proximate to a major project like a mine, an oil and gas facility, hydroelectric, wind development. And in these contracts, the community provides consent or support for a new project or investment in return for some sort of benefits. And there's usually a mutually agreed upon dispute resolution mechanism written into the contract. Benefits by the community that are reaped by the community are wide ranging. They can often include things like local hiring, procurement targets, grants for local development initiatives, ways to limit the negative impacts of a development, and sometimes even the distribution of profits to the community. Now, if this is sounding really expensive and complicated to you, then you're in the same boat my co-author and I were in about 7 years ago when we started to set out to find out when and why these companies do this. And so here's what we did and found. We looked at all the mining companies proposed in Canada over the last 20 years or so, and looked at which ones had signed one of these contracts, these community benefits agreements, and with which community. Over 300 of them had been signed. And what we found is that project proponents were more likely to sign these CBAs with communities that bore the brunt of environmental and social externalities associated with the project, with communities that had use rights to the land where the project was to be situated. And finally, with communities that had a history of engaging in protest, not against the focal firm, but in protest in general. So that might sound a little strange, right? So you're signing contracts with people that might be or already troublemakers. Well, it turns out investors also like that too. So in a separate study, we looked at the stock market reactions to the unexpected announcements of these contracts. And it turns out that signing a contract with a community with strong property rights to the land or a history of protesting actually more than doubled the value of the median market cap firm in our sample. So rather than being viewed as a cost of doing business, formal contracts with communities can be actually seen as an investment that pays out. Now you may be wondering, okay, how does this make sense? But if you consider the costs that are associated with the withdrawal of community consent for a major project, once it's started construction or is operational, it starts making sense. In mining, the cost of a local community withdrawing its consent and the project proponents being prevented from actually accessing the mine are estimated somewhere around $20 million per week for projects with a capex of $3 billion. Another study found that upwards of 70% of the valuation of gold mines is actually determined by the degree to which these non-market stakeholders support the mine. That could be politicians, local communities, activists. So when you consider that these formal contracts not only provide benefits to communities to help them offset some of the externalities that are naturally associated with any major project, but they also detail the ways by which the project proponent and the local community are going to make mutual adjustments over the life of the project and solve the disputes about the project outside the court system or outside the court of public opinion. You start realizing that these are effectively mechanisms by which you can de-risk the cash flows from major projects. So I'm going to end there. That's a lot I just threw out at you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kate. Peter, would you want to follow up on this and perhaps relate also these insights from Canada with what's happening here on the ground in Australia?
Thanks so much, Nuno, and thanks, Kate, and thank you for the invitation to join the panel. I want to start just by reflecting really quickly on an often confused aspect when we start to talk about the community, which is for very large public infrastructure that users and the community are a single group, that these people are the same with the same expectations, whereas indeed a user of an asset may return to their home if, for instance, it's a transport project, and turn from a user to a community member with a completely different set of considerations. And just to create a frame on that, certainly some work I was previously involved with at Infrastructure Australia focused very much on users being motivated by access, quality and cost of infrastructure services, whereas the community indeed being much more closely tied to sustainability orientated factors, or as I've seen in the comments this morning, the reference to ESG. So tying in ecological and environmental benefits, thinking about social implications, perhaps through social procurement or business enablement, thinking obviously about the economic impact of assets, including to some of those groups I've mentioned, but the final aspect around governance. And I really would like to take the opportunity this morning to accentuate and emphasize that final lens of a more holistic view of sustainability, thinking around governance, transparency, participatory decision-making, tying the outcomes of a project to the long-term vision and values of a community, and indeed embedding that in Project 13 parlance in the notion of outcomes. So for policymakers, often the priority in thinking about outcomes is to look cross-sector, breaking down verticals as could exist within infrastructure, for instance, a transport lens as distinct to energy or water, or indeed social infrastructure, and indeed trying to much better define those key aspects of value to a community, thinking about standard of living and thinking around some of those multi-factor aspects tied to sustainability. Thinking and clarifying and in fact codifying and defining outcomes for a society is incredibly difficult for political decision makers, and as a result, incredibly difficult for policymakers. But indeed, landing a crystallization of those issues, as has been achieved in some jurisdictions in Australia, for instance, New South Wales through the Premier's priorities, is critical to allowing a golden thread to be connected from the centre of government through to delivery, through to policy agencies and ultimately to project delivery. This idea of defining some outcomes, building them into a multi-sector strategy, embedding in spatial considerations, and ultimately project delivery. And indeed, that continuity is critical to ensure infrastructure delivers services rather than monument building, concrete and steel, and to make sure that those services are ultimately aligned to the community's expectations and able to be translated into an understanding of place. So those place-centric considerations, translating national goals into meaningful local understanding, ensuring that expert engagement and leadership in the community is able to see those outcomes embedded in a meaningful way and carried through not on a single project, but to shared outcomes across multiple projects is critical for success. And just one final point before I hand back to Nuno to mention, in Australia over the last decade, around $20 billion worth of projects have been cancelled, mothballed, or otherwise delayed due to community opposition, a really quite incredible number. And indeed, I feel it's a gross underrepresentation of the true costs of community opposition or barriers, where we see today many projects with teams of hundreds of staff mobilised, seeing those teams not working, tied up, because of delays, perhaps in environmental approval processes or other restrictions on work. And that hidden cost is held directly by the community in terms of delays of specific projects, but also because of the reduced market capacity to deliver on what is a very ambitious investment program. So these costs are considerable, and indeed they're building today. Thanks very much, Nuno.
Thank you, Peter. So with this background, perhaps Gemma can now give us some vivid illustration of how she's handling the relationship with the local communities in the context of Sydney Metro.
All right, thanks very much, Nuno. And yes, definitely, the introductions from Kate and Peter have resonated very, very close to home with me. So just a bit of an intro to myself and the Sydney Metro project. So I'm currently in the role of delivery director for the Western Tunnelling Package on the Sydney Metro project, Sydney Metro West. I currently work for Bechtel Infrastructure Group, and Bechtel are engaged as an integrated delivery partner with Sydney Metro West. And so we provide professionals into key roles and also integration across the Metro West. So we're very much working hand in hand, and I see myself as part of the Sydney Metro team. So very much embedded in that team. So the Western Tunnelling Package, for those of you who don't know, consists of 9 kilometres of dual bore TBM tunnels from Sydney Olympic Park through to Westmead, with a major earthworks package at Clyde, and that's where we're building up an earthworks platform for the future maintenance and stabling facility. This will be the only surface expression of the railway along the alignment. We're approximately 8 months into execution on what will be a 4-year project. So I've worked for Bechtel for 10 years, and I started as a mechanical engineer, and I've worked my way into design and project management. And this is my second major infrastructure project. So I've moved originally from our old oil and gas, now energy business unit about 4 years ago into major infrastructure projects. So previously working on Crossrail and now Sydney Metro. Obviously, from my perspective, the difference between a refinery or a gas plant is that the community impact is on these major infrastructure projects is immediate and obviously extremely critical for success. So from a Sydney Metro perspective, they undertake extensive mapping, planning, consultation, and where required, the agreement negotiations, so community benefit agreements, as Kate referred to them before, with a range of non-market stakeholders. So these stakeholders on the Western Tunnelling Package include local councils, businesses, multinational organisations, residents, schools, hospitals and emergency services, Aboriginal communities and land councils, utility companies, even nearby major projects that are taking place around the Western Sydney area, and other transport agencies and state departments. So critical for the success is obviously that early engagement and early planning prior to award, so that we have those expectations and agreements, if required, locked in prior to award. So some of the other key challenges that we face on a project like Sydney Metro are construction noise and out of hours working, property acquisition, which is required for a major project such as Sydney Metro West, supporting businesses and residential stakeholders in either relocation or helping them with the business disruption. We've also going through substratum acquisition as well. There's also other impacts, which include utility outages, maintaining access, even restoration of buildings, negotiating access to areas, and obviously the cumulative impacts of other major projects going on in the area. So Parramatta being a good example of where there is a lot of major projects going on in that space, with the Parramatta Light Rail project in conjunction with Sydney Metro coming through now as well. So obviously as a publicly funded project, it's important that we use that funding appropriately and with a clear public purpose for the resolution of any issues that come to hand. But as as Kate and Peter have also touched on, once we're in a live contract, these negotiations with the community become even more critical to ensure that we don't start to have a cost and a time impact to the project. So, because there may be some activities that are contingent on approval from a key stakeholder. So to mitigate that, sort of Sydney Metro have stakeholder and community focus with place managers, and we have that both within the Sydney Metro team and also within the contractors team as well. And those place managers and also interface managers are there to engage with the community early and also throughout the life cycle of the project to ensure that our construction timelines are met as well. So we maintain a very proactive approach, and also to make sure that we're keeping our stakeholders informed along the way. So it's just a bit of an introduction.
Okay, thanks very much, Em. And so perhaps I would, on that note, I would go back to Kate and ask Kate, from your research, because not all communities want to negotiate. No, sometimes people are ideologically opponent to a project, and if you sit around the negotiating table and try to build consensus, that consensus will never occur, because ideologically these people believe that the only solution to the problem is that this project is not going to happen. So from your research with mining organizations, what kind of insights do you have to share with managers? Where do they draw the line? When do they know that it's not going to work to try to put effort and resources and time to achieve these community benefit agreements? What sort of intuitions do they use to understand how to deal with these non-market stakeholders, Kate?
So the ones that are ideologically opposed is challenging. First of all, I think what you would want to do is actually determine if it's an ideological opposition. And this is not specific to my research. I used to work in these agreements professionally up in the Canadian Arctic. And sometimes it may look ideological, but there are other politics at play. And so I think sort of uncovering and getting a little bit more intelligence and understanding the position of the community as it relates to other things in their environment. The specific example I'm thinking about is an Indigenous community that was blocking a $16 billion natural gas pipeline. And it's certainly the rhetoric and the framing of their concerns sounded ideological, but if you step back and understood that their land claim agreements were not being heard by the federal government, you could understand that this was actually a triadic governance problem, right? The federal government was not addressing a legitimate land claim issue that was basically in turn causing this community to hold up the project. And so I would always sort of hesitate to sort of say, is this a deadlock ideological opposition? I would do more research. I think there's a lot more going on. Beyond that, I feel like I don't have as much of the project proponent perspective that perhaps someone like Peter or Jenna would have, where they've come across that. I know in my other research with environmental activists, and this is more on the sort of consumer product side, there are real benefits to collaborating with people that are your opponents. Mm-hmm. But there's a line where ideology will never allow you to see eye to eye, right? So the idea with collaboration is you, with your sort of opponent or potential critic, are coming to an understanding over time that is eventually sort of codified in some sort of contract or some sort of agreement. There will be some counterparties where I think that progress would be very, very difficult to make.
Okay, so, and Peter, how can policymakers help, given that there is this range of opposition, some of which can evolve into a cooperative relationship and even be codified into a community benefit agreement or other sort of agreement. But in some other cases, and I'm thinking about High Speed 2 in the UK, where the project has been legally approved, they have the right to acquire land, but activists continue to try to prevent the project from going ahead, and they even had to ask for an injunction to be able to criminalize any activist that gets near the project and tries to stop the project. So I know that in the UK we have sometimes these budget uplifts, so they know that there are going to be problems, and so they give managers a pot of money by which they can try to manage these no-market stakeholders and try at the same time to keep this narrative that the project is on time, on budget, which is also an important narrative. But perhaps as a policymaker, you have other insights how to try to reconcile these challenges of managing no-market stakeholders, and at the same time with a narrative that's also society expects that everything is going fine, we'll be delivering on time and on budget.
Nuno, there's so much in what you've just commented on there. So let me try to touch on some of it to say, and to indeed bring the conversation back just a couple of steps. Infrastructure and indeed more broadly, large projects are about delivering on the expectations of society and the community. So infrastructure most particularly exists for public good, but some of the resource projects that Kate mentioned are ultimately, in a gas sense, ultimately about enabling energy or about supporting industrial processes or perhaps fuel for export. But what we really need to keep in mind is they are about servicing a market, and that market is the user group, who ultimately is the first group of proponents or supporters for a project within a community. So really important to make sure that you are able to crystallize those messages, as I've mentioned before, around access, quality, and cost of services. But in doing that, it's critical not to lose sight of the legitimacy of the community's view. We all live somewhere, ideally, and for most of us, we're passionate about our communities, and we place particular values on what defines it and why we've chosen to call it home. So it's really important to take those outcomes, as I've mentioned earlier, and to be able to communicate them in a way that aligns with the values of place, so that people can understand how those project aims and objectives that might be national or attached to the users are able to create some value for them within the place they call home or the place that they might conduct their business. In doing that, Project 13 and indeed collaborative contracts broadly provide a mechanism, which is to define outcomes up front and to create flexibility through the procurement and tender process to allow industry to innovate to deliver those outcomes. So this really critical component of collaborative contracting, which is around moving away from solution definition right up front, allows industry and those involved in project delivery to innovate, to change, to tweak scope in order to make sure they're delivering a project that can balance those expectations. So I really think that we need to consider the role of collaborative contracting, not just about the relationship between industry and client, but also how community can be brought more into that process, the roles of practices like deliberative democracy that might allow some level of empowerment of a group of people that are closer to the community that's impacted in order to make decisions within a predefined set of boundaries around issues or around resources and time. And we've seen that deliver some success in Australia. And I'd point to the New Democracy Foundation, an organisation that was funded in its setup from the family, the Bongiorno Nettis, who established Transfield, one of Australia's long-term historical tier one contractors who are involved in critical projects like the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. The Bongiorno Nettis family saw the value around that localisation and engagement, and indeed the role of the community in that empowered decision-making.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Jim, building on the Peter's remarks, I'm quite intrigued about the extent to which you find the flexibility in the relationships with your suppliers to accommodate the vagaries and the realization of uncertainty that derives from the relationship with the communities. No, so we have seen that irrespective if we are on a lump sum contract or reimbursable type of contracts, the fact is that there will be, as you deal with local communities, this is going to put pressure on the execution of your supplier contract. And sometimes there is this suspicion that suppliers then become opportunistic, and even so they will start, well, we now need to adapt the targets, and this costs more and more and more. And so some people are skeptical that actually collaborative contracts with the supply chain are having the effect that we would want in terms of preventing suppliers from behaving opportunistically in the face of uncertainty that results from interaction with non-market stakeholders. What is your perception on that? To what extent you are finding that collaborative contracts with suppliers are encouraging the right behaviors when it comes to facilitate interaction with non-market stakeholders?
So, sorry, Nuno. So thank you. Yeah, at the moment, thankfully, we're not seeing that behaviour from the contractors, but obviously recognise that there is that risk. However, I mean, it's going back to that, trying to engage early in the planning processes within before the project is let or tendered, to really define what those relationships are, and and also and make sure that we've got sufficient mapping, engagement, and also feedback that then feeds into our contracts, so that we can have a clear expectation with these community and key stakeholders around how the project is going to be delivered and what are their requirements, which then can be fed into the contract, and then the contractor has a good visibility of what to expect. Obviously, we can't always anticipate certain situations that come up, but the contractor is given as much information as they can, and given ownership for those relationships, obviously really closely working with Sydney Metro as well, because we have, for example, on Western Tunnelling Package, we've got just a 4-year program, but the entire Sydney Metro program is 8 to 10 years, which will be, we have to have ongoing relationships with these community stakeholders. So we need to work collaboratively. And yes, okay, there probably is some skepticism, but I think it's really just working together. And at the moment, thankfully, everything is going well, but it's also reputational risk for our contractors as well. So if they start to behave, poorly and try to leverage certain uncertainties or difficulties for their own outcome, that will, it doesn't reflect well on them either. So they've got buy-in into the outcomes for the project as well. They want to succeed, and together we succeed. So it's very much working hand in hand, because it's not us and them, it's us all pulling in the right direction, and as well as the community as well, because for an infrastructure project like a metro, we are there to service the community in the end.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we have about 3 minutes, and so I have perhaps a quick question for each one of you. Kate, the mining industry was famous for some years ago, this approach that some of my colleagues call DAD, no? Decide, announce, do. So a very autocratic approach. And what you show is actually it has shifted towards a much more collaborative approach. And as you mentioned, doing community benefit agreements is not cheap. So what was the trigger? What made the mining industry change attitude?
There was a bunch of disasters, right? High-profile disasters helped in Canada as well as in Australia. The acquiring of formal rights of Indigenous peoples, right? That started bringing to light some of these issues. And finally, I think people are starting to cost into the projects actual risks related to non-market stakeholders. I teach this in my MBA class and people's like heads explode. They don't do this. Like when you run a net present value model in, you know, Procter and Gamble or wherever, no one is doing this. I think the construction industry and large product industry is one of the first industries in the world that's actually costing this stuff into their projects now.
And that is a fantastic lead for Peter, because if we start costing the relationship with no-market stakeholders, but if benefit to cost analysis does not account for non-user benefits, Peter, now we are in trouble, because from a value for money perspective in a traditional metric, no project will be value for money, because you have a lot of cost going into the denominator and you don't see extra benefits going into the numerator. To what extent do you see policymakers willing to update also traditional metrics to that measure value for money?
I definitely see the willingness of progressive policymakers to update their methodologies, but we need to be mindful that cost-benefit analysis is just one tool. It's not something that we should establish as the only mechanism for project decision-making. Ultimately, we're trying to drive our communities forward, so there are other tools that we need to keep in mind, as well as that focus on the objectives we're trying to unlock for the community.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Kate, between consultation often is something that needs to be done before the project is approved, but consultation does not, it's often the commitments that come out of consultation are what the law says you need to do, not necessarily that they go above and beyond the law. To what extent you see the outcomes of the negotiations with local communities going way above and beyond the law, so relatively to what had been promised during consultation?
Gemma. They often are beyond.
Actually, it was for Gemma question. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I think we. So, I mean, I don't think anything goes above and beyond the law. Obviously, we work a lot of our consultation around our environmental impact studies. So for Sydney Metro West, that is split up into 3 stages. So we have been through EIS 1, 2, and 3. And it's all the community feedback is then written into our conditions of approval, and that in itself is also a negotiation. So you know, it has to be on the lines of reasonableness as well. We can't just incorporate anybody's you know, wish list. It has to be, you know, it has to have that going back to that public purpose and an appropriate use of public funding. So that's really how that's kind of managed through that lens. So hopefully I've answered the question there.
Okay, so it's we just arrived to the end of our panel. We could continue the conversation for another hour, but we do need to go. And thank you all the panelists. It was I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we will continue this conversation in the future through other ways. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thanks, Nuno, and we'll actually continue on with these short research keynotes straight on from here. So thank you to very interesting panelists, and thanks very much for a very interesting conversation. It's actually great to have both academics and practitioners and advisors in these interesting conversations. So what we'd like to do now is actually welcome Professor Derek Walker, who's from RMIT in Melbourne. He's an emeritus professor. And so, Derek, I'll hand over to you. I'll pop back in at the end of your session to pass on the baton to the next presenter. So thanks, Derek. You're ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much. And also thank you to the John Grill Centre for asking me to give this short presentation and be involved. It's really interesting. And Nuno suggested I just do a very brief overview of what alliancing is, because a number of the participants probably are not quite aware. So alliancing is more than partnering on steroids. That's how I thought alliancing was when I first got involved in it, when I did some research on the National Museum of Australia at the end of the 1990s. It's a formal integrated project delivery agreement. And it's the key to it is integration, to develop the project time cost delivery plan, and then to actually implement it. So it's centered on an integrated team with agreed common objectives, very much what the discussion has been going on this morning. And it's entrenched through a pain gain incentive process based on project performance and not individual performance, which helps get the motivation going. And it's also dependent on effective collaboration, people being able to flag early warning signs early, and resilience of the team to respond, because all of the pain share, gain share is about how the project goes and not just how the team went. And it's characterized by a no blame workforce, consensus decision making, and shared leadership. The program alliance links alliance projects in a coherent, synergistic whole. So the difference between a project alliance and a program alliance is that the program alliance is meant to pull together all the projects into one consistent whole. So what I want to talk about a little bit today is really around a program alliancing. Project alliances have been around for decades in Australia, as I mentioned. The National Museum of Australia, which opened in March 2001, was actually the first building rather than infrastructure alliance project. There's infrastructure project alliance projects around that time, well before then. And in fact, Stuart Clegg and some of his colleagues have written a very well-cited paper about the water storage tunnels that was part of the Olympic preparations for the Olympics in Sydney. Program alliances, they do share some similarities with framework agreements, but they're quite different in many other respects. The framework agreements tend to be for very small things. The program alliances are usually for very big sort of mega project type size projects. So they're organized a series of project alliances, and the one I'd like to sort of focus on briefly, because I've only got about 5 minutes left, is on the level crossing removal program. Now that started in 2015. This is a Melbourne project or program, and the government had committed to removing 50 level crossings and renewing existing rail stations and improving their precincts. Sounds a little bit sort of ordinary, just removing level crossings. What's such a big deal about that? Well, you can imagine there's quite a lot of interfaces. It's very, very complex. And it's in brownfield sites, and you've got to keep the network moving, both the road and the rail. It grew. The project was very successfully sort of going along nicely, and then in the follow-up election, the government increased the scope to 85, from 50 to 85, to be completed at the end of this year at $16.3 billion. Now, at the moment, or at least by September, it was running ahead of time and below cost. 66 of those had been delivered. There's an approach called the target outturn cost approach, which is similar to that used in the United States, but I think it was target value design, I think it was called, as part of lean construction. Those of you that are familiar with lean construction probably knows familiar with target cost estimating. But it's more than just the cost. It's the time and it's the delivery program at all. So that begs the question, what's a reasonable cost of time, and what is value and what is valued? And that's a question that's cropped up earlier today in the discussions. There's a paper that I wrote with two of my colleagues called Improved Reliability in Planned Large-Scale Infrastructure Project Delivery through Organising. And that was published earlier this year. And I certainly pass on that link easily enough for you. So some of the characteristics of the level crossing program is about best value rather than value for money. Well, all the rhetoric's around value for money, but it does bring in best value. And it's interesting, that last conversation about the bringing social benefits to all of this, because one of the key result areas that the level crossing removal program has got is what they call legacy, and that's to improve the situation for both not just road and rail users, but the communities around the stations that are being totally renovated and replaced in many ways. So it's strategic project delivery for best value. There's integration of the design with multimodal passenger mobility. So it's actually been purposely designed to link really well in with the tram, taxis, etc., etc. There's the integration of both the rail and the road operator within the program and project teams, which is quite novel. There's continuous improvement and innovation focus and rewards, and that's governed through something called a joint communication committee. The focus is on program management approach. And just to finish off, we've got an upcoming special issue in the journal IEEE-TM on organizations such as this that are involved in managing programs of projects. And we've got an upcoming book on the level crossing removal program as a case study, which should come out in early 2024. With that, I'll finish and hand over to the next keynote speaker. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thanks, Derek. That was perfect. I think some of your research talks about managing expectations about delivery speed, and your timing was impeccable. So now I would like to introduce Professor Christopher Whyte, who is from the University of Sydney Business School.
Yes, thanks very much. I've got basically 8 minutes to tell you a bit about the research that colleagues and I have been doing, probably for about the last 15 years, actually, around how businesses and politicians have contributed and responded to the climate crisis. So most of my research focuses on climate change and the political and economic sort of issues around that. And I've just titled this presentation, Organising Responses to Climate Change, Mitigation, Adaptation and Suffering as Political Projects. That's actually the title of our recently published book, and I've just tweaked the title a bit to include the term projects given today's symposium, because in a sense what we're really arguing in our book and in our recent research has been around this issue of why it is that despite the scientific consensus on the urgency of the climate crisis and how bad things are getting, there is so little tangible response to that. And so our argument is that the responses, or the lack of tangible, effective response to climate change, is actually an organised political process, or possibly a project in that sense. So if we go to the next slide, so this was our previous book in 2015, which basically tried to unpick this issue that the American investigative journalist Elizabeth Kolbert phrased in an earlier book, where she raises this issue about why this conundrum, why it seems impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself. But that's what we're now in the process of doing. And in our earlier book and in our just recently published book, that has been the sort of the key issue for us as people, social scientists interested in this issue. Why is it that we know technologically what is needed to decarbonize a global economy, and yet action is so limited, so minimal, and we're careering towards, as the UN was saying last week, probably around 2.5 degrees C above pre-industrial warming on a business as usual trajectory, if not worse than that. So next slide. The problem, of course, is not particularly profound. It's not rocket science. We've basically got a global economic system that's predicated upon annual compound growth ad infinitum, GDP growth continuing forever and ever and ever. And the dominant way in which we get that growth is through increased energy consumption. And depending on which countries you're looking at, but globally, the vast bulk of that energy comes from fossil energy, comes from coal, oil, and gas. Next slide, thanks. So the issue here is really around why that is, and that slide doesn't really show what I wanted it to show, but that's all right, I'll just talk to it. This is our recent book. We're basically arguing that there are growing international commitments for decarbonisation, as we've seen the various COPs and the various UN commitments to Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, for instance, to try and avoid greater than 2 degrees warming, or possibly even 1.5 C. So commitments, pledges, there's growing political and social activism over climate change that is becoming evident in movements like the school climate strikes and Extinction Rebellion and fossil fuel divestment. So there's growing social critique of the current political project. And yet, what we term fossil fuel hegemony, the dominance of coal, oil, and gas continues. So our question is, how does that happen? How is that actually achieved politically and economically? And so in our recent book, that's the cover of it, we basically look at and unpick how the corporate politics of carbon mitigation or emissions mitigation, climate adaptation, and climate suffering are actually created and maintained over time. Next slide, please. So if we look at, for instance, the mitigation piece, we phrase this essentially as the politics of predatory delay, or possibly even the project of predatory delay, which is really about major energy producers, the big oil companies, BP, Shell, Gazprom, Saudi Aramco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. BP, of course, in 2020 was one of the first to come out with a commitment to net zero emissions, which is a heroic assumption for an oil company. And of course, national governments since then have all jumped onto the net zero by 2050 sort of commitment. So there's a bandwagon effective business around commitments to decarbonisation, but also a commitment to continue growth and expansion of fossil energy. So there is this sort of conundrum. So how are the net zero commitments actually made discursively, and then how are they actually projected in terms of practice? And so there are proposals for technological fixes like carbon capture and storage, and discourses of clean gas, the hydrogen economy. And in doing that, of course, there's a distinction between what they see as sensible transition, which is minimal incremental change, versus others who propose more extreme type solutions. Next slide, please. In terms of adaptation, we're really focusing on how big corporations globally are trying to limit their operational and physical risk to climate impacts, but also on the flip side of that, the opportunities, the new markets, the new products, whether that's around sort of discourses of climate resilience, the advisory services that go around with that, disaster management, as well as the sort of the new market opportunities of a melting Arctic, changes in fisheries, changes in geology, which might assist greater fossil fuel extraction as well. Next slide. The third element in the book is basically looking at climate suffering and how that is structured politically in ways that don't really change things, I guess. And particularly we're looking at the way in which extreme weather events in developing economies are often constructed as climate spectacles. And this reinforces a sort of a politics of pity and caring at a distance, where we can offer thoughts and prayers to those who are suffering the impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, the South Pacific Islands, the flooding in Pakistan, for instance, and yet at the same time there's almost a sort of a raising the drawbridge as the developed economies increase their borders and try to sort of deal with the growing climate catastrophe. Next slide. So alternatives, we also sort of look at, well, what's the alternative to what's currently happening? And I haven't got time to go through these in detail, but we focus on three key issues here: decarbonisation, so the move towards renewable energy at scale and how that might be achieved with solar, wind and battery storage. We also look at proposals for degrowth, which is not really about blanket degrowth of entire economies, but degrowing the sectors that are impacting and harming climate ambitions and growing the sectors that are. And then finally, democratization, which can take the forms of improved democratization of energy and food and transport, and moving away from the centralized sort of corporate models that dominate our political economy. So final slide, thanks. So I'll finish with this. Obviously, 8 minutes, I haven't really got time to go through the details of what we look at, but by all means, have a look at the book. There's a lot in it. And I'll finish this slide. You might have seen this cartoon by Tom Toro in the New Yorker magazine some years ago. It, in a sense, humorously, I think, gets to the bizarre, surreal reality we now face, where we're looking at the destruction of the life support systems of the planet. And yet that is justified around commitments to improved shareholder value. So I'll finish there, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Christopher. That was fantastic. I think it's a good Christmas present, I've decided, your book. So now I would actually like to welcome Professor Nuno Gill, who is a visiting professor here at the John Grill Institute at Sydney University, but originally, he is substantively at University of Manchester. So Nuno, I'll pass over to you.
I'll briefly introduce today this idea about what I call the capital project dilemma. And what is that capital project dilemma? So I'll explain that by just trying to be as brief as possible. And next slide, Margaret, please. So if we think about the capital intensive investments, in order for them to be approved, we tend to use in Western societies cost benefit analysis, right? So cost benefit analysis is a tool that has been developed more than 100 years ago by French engineers, and then that it was appropriated or by the economists in the 40s, late and 50s, no? And it became the way by which we as a society tend to sanction capital investments, project-based capital investments. So in this idea that if we are going ahead with these investments, the benefits need to outweigh the costs. And this has created a number of complications that are exacerbating in recent years, because there's so much we can measure, right? So when we are, and this goes back to the session before, no? So we cost benefit analysis, it tends to be predominantly focused on economic returns, things that we can measure based on user willingness to pay. So we are going to build this Sydney Metro, or we are going to build a Crossrail in London, or we are going to build this power station, and we know that there will be an output that users are willing to pay for it, to use that. So whether it is electricity, water, or transport, and that creates a revenue, and then we can play that future revenue against the costs of producing the assets. And that's kind of what cost benefit analysis does. Okay, we can extend it a little bit to incorporate wider economic implications, but there's a lot of other stuff we know projects are under pressure to do that is very difficult to go into the cost benefit analysis. So I tend to tell my students and whether in executive education or in undergraduates, that what we are approving these days, it tends to be what we can define, what we can't, and what we can observe. Next slide, please. But what we approve, is fundamentally different from what we actually build, right? It's not going to be the same. There's no way in at least in open access societies, liberal economies, that will be able to to build what we approve. So this creates, and that slide kind of illustrates an evolution, which is kind of the stereotypical behavior of capital-intensive projects, of costs over time for one particular project. This case is a Crossrail, this commuters rail that is going to cross London from east to west. And over time, that project was negotiated with society in terms of what should this project be about, what sometimes economists call the externalities that the project needs to internalize. So you have all these interest groups in society after the project has been approved that say, well, that project can't go ahead because what is that project doing for the environment? What is that project doing in terms of local job creation? Well, I don't think the designs for the stations are good enough. They should be world-class designs because they should also be opportunities to showcase the talent of architects in the British environment, and so on and on and on. And so you keep negotiating the scope with society after the project gets approved. And of course, this is going to create many benefits. But those are not the traditional benefits that go into the cost-benefit analysis, right? These are benefits that are going to be captured by groups of non-users, whether it is the architectural fraternity that is going to benefit from an investment in world-class designs, where there are local communities because are going to benefit from the addition of new car parking spaces near the stations, whether it is labor that is going to benefit for an improvement in health and safety laws, or the society as a whole, because it's going to benefit from a late improvement in security and other standards. No, so our expectations as society evolve, and the project keeps negotiating its purpose, and that translates into a scope as the project gets in the early stages of development, throughout development, and then as it enters into the river. And the projects are approved much earlier, right? So even when you policymakers approve a project, the planning or the development there is not yet completed, no? So you have this evolution about until we understand what society is going to permit. And this now creates a real dilemma, because from a traditional perspective of in the project management profession, this evolution of cost growth is something that is penalized, right? So it seems to be bad management that the cost was not being able to be controlled, to stay within that ideal budget. And sometimes also this negotiation of the project with society also implies that the project is going to take longer, which again, and the traditional project management norms, it's going to be penalized, because these are about delays. We have these deep-seated mental models that say that high-performing projects should stay on time. And if you read a lot of the work that is coming out from the artificial intelligence fraternity applied to projects, they keep beating the drum. Well, use artificial intelligence and we'll help your project stay on time. So there are lots of vested interests in society as well to perpetuate a narrative that a high-performing project is one that stays on time within budget, which is totally in tension with another narrative that says a high-performing project is one that distributes value, that goes beyond producing economic returns to also allow non-user groups to appropriate value. So, and now this creates a dilemma for managers, and that leads to my last slide, which is, at what point in time do you enfranchise your non-user stakeholders, right? And perhaps, Margaret, you can move to the last slide. So, because if you enfranchise the non-user stakeholder, okay, this is just a slide of projects as social tools to distribute value. And the first on the left, you kind of have a map of the key non-user stakeholders for London 2000, the Olympics, and you can see the amount of stakeholders that are going to, they are all essential in the sense that they all control essential resources without which the project will not progress, whether it is political support, whether are permits or consents or other type of resources. No, so you really have to negotiate that scope with the stakeholders. And below, sometimes people say, well, that is only happens for large projects. The project below actually is relatively small. It's just an expansion of an existing highway. And with our students, we just try to map all the non-user stakeholders that have been trying to directly influence the project scope. And again, we were surprised to see the complexity of stakeholder relationships that happen just around a relatively small highway expansion project. So what is the dilemma? The dilemma here is, when should I enfranchise all these stakeholders? Now, because if I traditionally, the law says you need to consult stakeholders, right? But consultation means that you still retain authority to make unilateral decisions as to what you are going to give to these stakeholders. So you don't need to negotiate. Now you consult because the law says you need to consult, and if you don't consult, you are violating the law. And then you shut the door and you decide, what should I do to make sure that I meet the concerns that are legitimate of my stakeholders? And you can do that in a unilateral way. And that keeps you within the law. But what we know is that is not going. But if you just do that, it will be fine from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, but probably you are going to face significant cost growth once you actually start to engage in consensus-oriented negotiations with stakeholders. But if you enfranchise them too earlier, then you run into a different problem, right? Because then you start making concessions or compromises with your stakeholders that puts pressure on your cost growth. The benefits are not being captured by traditional cost-benefit analysis. So people see, wow, I don't understand where the money is going. Why should we proceed with this project? So this is a real dilemma that we are just about to start tackling in the project management literature. And I believe it really entails an exciting research agenda. Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks, Nuno. Okay, so our next presenter is actually in his evening. He's from University of Quebec in Montreal in Canada. So thank you. I'd like to introduce Professor Alejandro Romeros-Torres.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to talk with you. And I think that the topics that we are discussing about the stakeholders and the value creation is related about what I are presenting today. So today I will present one of my research program that have a start in 2020. That is how we can use data, this data that is related to the digital technologies that we are using in project management in order to try to give more insight to the project, but also to try to analyze new areas that we have not analyzed before because we didn't have the data. So if we move to the next slide, I just want to place that right now we are in a digital transformation, and a lot of organizations are trying to implement new technologies because they are trying to develop new capabilities. And these capabilities are accessibility, connectivity. So we want to have access to the information and data that we have right now in the organization. We will, at the same time, we want to digitalize and automatize some of the processes. And that is also for temporary organization as a project. And then for implementing these 4 capabilities, we are implementing several types of technologies. It could be Internet of Objects, it could be Internet, mobile technologies, and also big data. That is a way that we are implementing in order to be able to collect different sources of data. And in function of different models of each organization, they're going to develop different types of solutions. In this research, I now focus on the digital and how we are using the digital technologies. Indeed, I try to focus on datafication. What is datafication? Is how we can give a value of all this capacity of collecting data Sometimes we are collecting traditional data that we already have in a project, but sometimes we are going to have new sources of data. If we move to the next slide, I will present some example of data that we can have in a mega project, but also in a public project. So we're going to have traditional data that comes from the project owner, but also the project contractor, that are all the project files. So we're going to have data about the planning, data about how we are controlling the project, about some decisions. But also with this digital transformation, we can introduce the Internet of Objects, that is having sensors in order to supervise, in order to try to master what is happening in the project and get this data in order to make better decisions. So project files and Internet of Objects, to the right side of the slide, there are data that are related to the project owner and the different organizations that are working in this temporary organization. But if we look to the public data, we also have data about the projects that are related to the social media, the citizens that are talking about the projects. We have also data in the traditional media, the newspaper, TV, radio. They are also giving data about the project. Sometimes there are accurate data, sometimes there are fake data, but also us as researchers, we are collecting data about the projects. And that could be interesting to try to develop these big data capabilities in order to be able to consolidate the data, in order to look for new ways to understand some projects. So if we move to the next slide, I will present some ideas about mega projects. And the idea here is trying to also to contribute to better understand why projects have a poor performance. And for that, we had a lot of research that have demonstrated that we had cost overruns, benefit shortfalls, and we are not creating value in function of the Nuno presentation. And there are some research that have also tried to identify what are the reasons. And here, if we think about such data that comes from social media, we can maybe bring some ideas about the reason of decision-making behavior, that is a reason of poor performance, but also about the stakeholders' engagement and management. If we move to the, thank you, to the animation, we can see for stakeholders' engagement and management, sometimes when we're talking about the society, about the users, about the community that's going to be impacted by the project, sometimes it's very difficult for the project manager, but also for us as researchers, to have information about them, because they are a very big group of people. They are totally diverse. They have different expectations. They have different place of legitimacy. And for using current and traditional research methods, we are going to be able to collect all the data. However, I propose to use social media as a new way in order to be able to collect new data about them and trying to use this data in order to understand the dynamics of these stakeholders in the project. So if we move to the next slide, I will present some of the elements that we are working on using social media. So opinions that we are sharing in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other technologies, we can be able to analyze this data and try to bring answers to three important questions. So first one, who is using the social media in order to be able to communicate their opinion about a specific project? We want also to know about what are their opinion. They have elements that are related to the project, is aligned with the project, or there are elements that try to change the way we are managing the project, or what is the project and what is the creation of the project. So that is about what, but also the most important is also to understand how some people with their opinion on social media can change the view of other people that also are related to the project. And for doing that, we are using different theories. So for the who, we are using the stakeholders theory. For trying to answer the question about what, we are trying to use the paradox theory because we want to try to identify points of contradictions, elements of collaboration. And to answer the question how, we are using also the collective action theory because we want to understand how people develop a collective identity, they develop an interest or group, and how they can use their opinion and different ways to communicate in order to develop a social capital. Another contribution that we want to do with this research is that we have what we call the project narrative. And that is a research that was executed by Graham Winch that tried to explain that sometimes what we are, our opinion about that project can change the way we are managing the project and also the final deliverable. Indeed, understanding how people are using the social media in order to change the way we are managing the project can also give a contribution to the narrative of projects. So we are working on that. We are using some projects in Quebec that have an important exposition, and there are many people that are talking about them. However, if we move to the last slide, and this is my last slide, I will conclude with that, is that sometimes using social media is going to be difficult. Because there are some difficulties, because sometimes we are thinking that we are having more access to more stakeholders, but what we need to consider is that there are some important stakeholders that they are not using the social media. So that is one of the limits. Another limit is that we're having projects that have a visibility, but visibility in social media. But what happened with the project that are not in the social media? We cannot be able to also to try to understand the dynamics. And the last two concerns, I know that my time is over, is the ethical part. And finally, is also technical competencies, because in order to be able to collect this data, we need to have more multidisciplinary team in order to be able to develop the infrastructure and also be able to analyze the data. So thank you so much for your time. And if you have questions, please communicate with me.
Thank you, Alejandro. That was incredible. It's obviously a symposium on project leadership and project management. Everybody is very good on scheduling. So the next speaker is Dr. Mohammed O'Day from Penn State.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And hopefully, I know I have, 7-8 minutes to, just give, some of the highlights of the research that we've been working on. Let me just introduce myself very quickly. My name is Mohammed Ode. I'm a teaching assistant professor at Penn State, Burn in Erie, Pennsylvania. Before that, I was in the industry. I worked in project management, different capacities for well over 30 years. So basically, my research or my work revolves around innovation and the impact of emerging technologies in project management. Now, if you review the literature today, and you will find a lot of it talk about why projects fail and the percentages of project fail, and due to different reasons, regardless whether it's on time or on budget or scope creep or whatever. So I'm just using a simple, authentic data that is coming from the PMI, the Pulse of the Profession. And this is an annual report that comes out every year that talks about the different aspects of project management. And I just picked up the statistics just to illustrate a point. So basically, they've been talking about this for a very long time. And the in principle, the concept of it is, projects do fail, dramatically over, for a number of reasons. And we can go into a lot of discussion as to why and what's the the countermeasures that we can take into trying to do them better. But really, I mean, do we continue doing the same tools, or advance the tools or the techniques, or look at things from a different angle, or do we really need some sort of an overhaul, a transformation? Now, transformation is a journey. It's not something like you just simply, as we all know, you flip the switch and you transform. It's a journey that that we go through. And basically, the objective of it is to transfer two things: to transfer project managers into leaders, and to transfer PMOs into innovative PMOs. So the proposed innovation, as a result, this comes from both research experience, social experience. And at the same time, it's a work in progress. So it's by no means a carved in stone framework, but rather a stepping stone. If I may. So the framework talks about transforming the current framework, or moving it from a traditional to a transformative, and basically it's based on two domains. Now, there are so many different flavors of IPMOs, of PMOs, for example. you hear about, the project management office, the strategic project management office, the organizational level project management office, and so on and so forth. What I'm really calling for is an innovative project management office, which basically relieves the idea behind it is to relieve the project managers, or the project leaders rather, from a lot of the legwork, a lot of the just worrying about the traditional things of just balancing constraints. No longer should they just, they need to worry about balancing constraints in terms of time, cost, and scope, and budget, and so on. But they need to think beyond that. They need to think, a little bit more innovative. So the idea behind it is to have this done at the PMO level, where they can, make use of the analytics and the use cases and the emerging technologies, such as the big data analytics and artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence could be used in so many different ways. And I'm not talking about, the pure machine learning or the pure robotics part of it, but I'm talking about the information intelligence part of it. So if we were to give that sort of task or activity to the PMO to come up with, to use information intelligently, gather information intelligently, use it, come up with more advanced and more innovative tools and techniques, and at the same time handle the integration collaboration, come up with a dynamic resource model that can not only address the resource requirements of the project, but try to forecast the requirements of the project for for not only the current project, but for so many different projects. And they will also be in charge of the total quality management. So a systematic way of conveying quality standards, quality management, and quality controls, and so on. That would, in my mind, and in the proposed framework, relieve the project manager or the project leader from those activities, and they will help, or they will just feed into the the project leader to use those and to utilize and to benefit from them. And they will focus on managing and controlling the project from a plan, execution, monitor, and all the the life cycle that we're all familiar with, and at the same time help the project manager or the project leader rather with risk identification, time management, budget, scope, and so on and so forth. So basically, the proposed framework is sort of a marriage between the PMO and the project leader activities and tasks, so that we can hopefully create that leadership qualities. So if you can move to the next slide, I can explain a little bit. So basically, the divorce away or move away from the traditional practices of having the project managers focus on balancing constraints, and at the same time having the PMO focus on just pushing controls and pushing the organizational standards and methodologies, but rather come up with innovative ways of using the technology that's available to us today. The science is in our side. The weight of science is on our side, and we can take advantage of it. So these things like coming up with apply analytics and identify use cases, and the proper use of artificial intelligence and information intelligence, and like I said earlier, coming up with a dynamic resource management and an innovative way of identifying, mitigating, analyzing, and mitigating risk. Basically, hopefully, we can reach a formula where the project leaders are focusing on creating value, focusing on effectiveness rather than think beyond effectiveness and balancing the constraints. So basically, the job of the project leader would be, rather than worrying about what the project is in the operation of the project or the day-to-day tasks and activities of the project, but rather create or influence the outcome and influence the the organization as a whole. If you could go to the last slide, please. Now, the research tells us a lot about literature tells us a lot about management leadership qualities, but I wanted to sort of dissect that a little bit and put it in 3 different categories where hopefully we can create that leadership part of the project manager, or transform the project managers into project leaders, so that they can start thinking conceptually, and they have they would have more time and more effort put into coming up with innovative ways of approaches to solving problems, and of course embrace technologies, because the advancement in technology, whether we like it or not, it is basically forcing us as a community, not as a project manager, but as a whole, to use their effect and their impact. So we cannot just simply shy away from what the technology is doing and the advancement. We can just simply try to embrace it and use the best out of it to come up with that formula that will give us leaders that can think conceptually and not transactionally, and at the same time be accountable, and at the same time enable the team. The more the team leader enables the team in terms of giving them the power and listening to their ideas and initiatives, the more chances we have of successful projects, and that will hopefully help us, with trying to, where we have the success, the needle of the success rate twitching upwards. And then, of course, another thing is that is also an important quality of project leadership is being engaged. Doing the competency assessment and performance review, and this is a continuous process. Motivate, inspire the team, share the knowledge, try to come up with a way to translate tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge, so that the PMO, so that the results of the current project that they are working on can feed back into the PMO, into the knowledge base, and this is sort of a loop that the PMO will benefit from the ever expanding set of information that comes out of project, and at the same time it feeds back into the project leaders to use and have a better chance of managing projects. Thank you very much for having me and for the time to share this some of these thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. Sorry to move us along, but we have our final keynote presentation from Professor Jennifer Whyte, who is the Institute Director for the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership and the head of the School of Project Management in the Faculty of Engineering at University of Sydney. So Jennifer, we'll move your slides on. Thank you.
I wanted to start just by, kind of explaining that I've been doing work on major infrastructure projects over the last 20 years. And a lot of my work has been around this mega project ecology, studying the cluster of infrastructure projects in and around London. They've been really, really well researched in the international research literature. Myself, Nuno, Jill, Andy Davies and others have been studying these projects. But for me, one thing that's interesting and picks up perhaps on things that we were talking about in the first panel session was when I went into Heathrow Terminal 5, I looked at that roof sub-project, how they lifted the roof. And there, everybody in that project said it was the best project they'd ever worked on. They really enjoyed being on that roof sub-project because the different leaders stepped forward at different points in that process. So a part of that, the architect was in charge, and then someone from the construction contractor was in charge, but they worked really well together as a team, and they shared the leadership around that team. And I was looking particularly at the single model environment in that project, and which is a forum to BIM and digital technologies. Then we worked with project leaders on the Olympics, on the London 2012 Olympics, on Crossrail, on Tideway, High Speed 2, major projects in and around London. And the research was focused on topic areas like data handover, which we looked at in the Olympics. How do you hand over data, all the difficulties of that organizational transformation to owners and operators, managing change. We did a set of studies around Crossrail, also working with Airbus and CERN in Europe, and looking at the dynamics of how you manage change on at a big scale on projects, configuration control, change management. We also did work looking at systems integration and how you integrate different systems. And especially when you've got this emerging complexity and uncertainty in these projects these days. And so for me, what's exciting about this set of projects is that not only were we working with practice, but we also worked with policy. And I became increasingly involved in the industry strategy in the UK. I worked on transforming construction, looking at how you brought off-site construction methods into the industry. I gave evidence at a parliamentary inquiry, sat on Construction Leadership Council, informed the work on building safely and on systems approaches to infrastructure delivery. And over the last couple of years, I've been in Sydney, and we've started to engage with the cluster of infrastructure projects that are now being built. And I think Sonia gave you the flavour of how this is a hot labour market. We're now building projects in Sydney that are on brownfield sites, so they're not the greenfield sites that the teams have been used to. They're increasing complexity. There's the challenge of getting the right projects at the right time. And we've been interested in studying this and studying particularly how when you've got a cluster of projects in a geographic area, how you can learn across those projects and how you can bring best practice across those projects. As an expat in Australia, I've also found myself interested in how we learn across the globe. And so we've been doing a little bit of work looking at Sydney Metro and its international comparators that I've studied previously. So we've looked at Nagpur Metro, we've looked at London Crossrail. And what's interesting here is that, of course, the same companies go around the globe and sometimes the same individuals and get involved in these really major projects because they're of such a significant scale. And I think there's real opportunities for us here in Sydney through the research that we're doing to bring research, practice and policy together. And I think that's something that I'm really excited about and I'm happy to connect with people around. I wanted to just touch on a couple of ideas that I've been developing in my research. So the first one of those is just standing back and taking a really broad view on how we make futures. So the work of making sense of possible and probable futures and evaluating, negotiating and giving order to preferred ones. Now, what we observed was that there were a set of scholars in different disciplines who were all looking at future making in some way or other, whether they were interested in projects, interested in research strategy, interested in design, interested in corporate strategy. And all of that thinking about, if you think about all of those as being about future making, then one of the things that's interesting is that uncertainty makes the future not wholly available to planning. And so if we have a strategy of trying to plan everything, then we're going to find that we've got these emerging uncertainties and complexities through that process that we have to handle. And we've framed future making in the work that we've been doing as a form of inquiry with representations of the future while being present in the world. And that's a way of thinking about the kinds of collaborative processes that came up in our panel sessions, and the way in which we can bring stakeholders together through an inquiry, through a process of inquiry, and work with representations of the future to work out both how we build better, but also what we build. And the paper that's just on the slide is a bit of work that we did saying how difficult this is to do in this kind of environment where we're online. So we believe that to make futures that matter requires real engagement with people, with places, with materials. And when we're online, we have such little interaction with some of those things. So we set out a paper with some advice to managers about how you can deliberately bring feedback into that situation, be attentive to who and to what is missing, and to ask for and engage them in terms of trying to get their input. How you can not fixate on one solution too quickly, and I think this plays to things that Peter Colacino and others were saying. We have to move away from, oh, this is the solution, to thinking about, what's the problem and what are the alternatives that we might use to address that. And do we understand the problem properly, right? So the idea of inquiry starts before the problem. It starts with the indeterminate situation that you then formulate into a problem. And changing medium, so using more than one representation, not getting locked in too early. And very quickly, the second area that we've started to do some work on, and well, actually, we've been working on this for a number of years, but we've just written a paper around this idea of projects as interventions. And before I came to Sydney, I ran a Centre for Systems Engineering and Innovation at Imperial College in London. And we've been very interested in the systems approach, and how do you see projects as an intervention into wider systems? Working with my colleagues in civil engineering, they've really pushed me to think about infrastructure, not just as an intervention into built environment systems or into the services that the built environment provides, but also into the natural environment. And myself and Lara Motti have just written a paper arguing that in a resource-constrained and changing world, the project scholarship community needs to revisit how it can conceptualize as a project, to understand it as an intervention into nature, experienced through a wide set of existing and future situations. Now, I know that's a challenging statement, but I think our observation was that that even when you look at the sustainability strategies of some of the major projects, nature gets lost because it all gets lumped together as ESG. And so, people are talking about their sustainability strategy in terms of growth, and not really taking on board some of the significant challenges around when you're making a future that matters, that's got material footprint on the world, how that engages with the natural environment. To wrap up the morning sessions, and if you're part of the emerging next generation of scholars and project practitioners, I would say your time is now. There's a lot of work to do to shape our future world and the way that it's delivered for the better. And I think projects have a big role to play in that. They can be part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution. And I think there's some really significant challenges that have been laid out for you by the speakers this morning. As this is the end of this part of the webinar, I would like to thank our chairs, panelists and speakers. It's been really fantastic and a very thought-provoking set of conversations taking the field forward.